Welcome to episode number 3 of the Find Your Calling channel. I'm glad you're here. In this episode, we pick up where we left off with the crash and burn of my ministry life. It was the beginning of a wilderness experience for me that ultimately led me to asking what was to be an important question in my own journey, which I'll reveal at the end of the episode. This episode is entitled Finding My Way and Learning to Be Still. Literally, within several weeks of that time, we ended up moving to a new town, hundreds of miles away. When we arrived at our destination, one of the first items on the agenda was to find a church to attend. We visited 9 different churches before finally locating one that we felt we could call home. By the time the dust settled from our having moved, finding a new church, getting kids settled in a new school, etc., I had come to a conclusion about my own personal calling. I had no clue what God really wanted me to do with my life. I was burned out and clueless at this point in my journey. I still believed God had a specific plan for me, but I didn't understand what it was. I began to reflect on my past and come to the conclusion that perhaps I had not taken enough time to wait on God. Maybe I had just been running off from one thing to the next, thinking that I had finally uncovered the coveted direction I was to take in life, without really perceiving the truth. Maybe what I needed was to slow down and resist my natural urge to pursue the next big thing. So I decided to wait. I made a commitment that, for the next year, I wouldn't join any church ministry and I would not try to personally fill in the blank concerning what my individual calling or purpose might be. I would go to church and keep up with my own personal devotional life and all that entailed, but I wouldn't try to define for myself whatever it was that God had created me to do. Instead, I would spend time in prayer and wait for God to show up and tell me what my calling was in whatever way He wanted to do so. That first year was hard. I felt such a strong pull to jump back into the next ministry, to fill in the blank, to busy myself and just do something. But I stuck with my determination to wait. Through that entire first year, I didn't hear anything concrete from God on what my calling was, and no concrete ideas began to form in my mind about what it might be. There was a question that did begin to form in my mind, however, and it was this: what will I do if God never tells me what my calling is? As 1 year stretched into 2, this question came to the forefront of my mind. As it did so, I began to re-examine what I had believed for so long about how calling and purpose are revealed and what the Bible actually teaches about these things. As time went on, I began to ask other questions. One of them was, why is it so hard to hear from God in prayer? I mean, if God is real, all-powerful, and all-knowing, couldn't He come up with a more reliable form of communication? How about an email service, for instance? Why not just drop me a line and make it abundantly clear what my calling is in a concise email and be done with it? Why all the drama? Why must some of us go through such a torturous, uncertain, drawn-out process on the way to finding our true callings? Eventually, a more alarming question began to pop up in my mind. If God might not tell me what my calling was, then what if I never found out at all? I'd always assumed I would. It was, in my mind, a given that I would, but I was in my mid-40s and still hadn't grasped what it was. How long was this supposed to take, for Pete's sake? Intrinsically, I felt that if I was to find the level of fulfillment in life that I desired to have, then it was essential that I be pursuing God's intended purpose for me as an individual. The thought that God might not ever tell me what that purpose was, or the more likely scenario that I wouldn't hear Him correctly, was terrifying. Humorous as some of these questions I'm asking might sound in hindsight, I was actually beginning the process of deconstructing my long-held beliefs about calling and purpose, and asking the questions that needed to be asked. The answers to the questions came slowly, with some missteps along the way. It wasn't pretty or neat or well planned on my part, but over the span of 5 years, I completed an important journey. I started from a place where false beliefs and an imperfect understanding of calling and purpose kept the carrot on the end of the stick always just out of my reach. I ended up in a place where I'm now absolutely secure and content in the knowledge of what my personal calling is. For me, the puzzle pieces finally fit. I've discovered what I was meant to do with my life, and I'm enjoying a greater level of personal fulfillment, peace, and contentment than ever before. The remainder of these videos reveal what I learned during my journey, as well as the steps by which you can take a similar path in order to discover your own uniquely personal calling in life. I firmly believe that if you follow the steps I'll outline, then you too can enjoy the fulfillment that only comes from knowing and pursuing your God-given purpose with your whole heart. As I began a season of backing off from the many ministry involvements that had characterized my life for decades, I started to feel uncomfortable. I almost immediately felt the desire to jump back into some ministry, even though I still had no idea what my personal calling was. But I had made a commitment to unplug for a year in order to really seek guidance from God about what He wanted me to be doing, rather than just go with what I felt. So I resisted this desire to fall back into my old pattern. As this uncomfortable feeling persisted, I began to perceive what it really was. I began to understand that the motivation behind this uncomfortable feeling was a desire to pursue and receive God's acceptance. I was, frankly, a bit surprised by this revelation. I was, after all, a Christian. Theologically, I believed that Jesus' sacrifice of His own life on the cross in payment for my sins had made me acceptable in God's sight, and that nothing I could ever do or be would increase or add to that level of acceptance that I already had. But what I came to realize as time went on was that while I believed this in my head, I didn't completely believe it in my heart. In my heart, I was still seeking God's approval, and I thought that if I was busy doing what I was called to do, then I would earn that approval which I was so desperately seeking. As I began to discover the truth about my need to earn God's approval instead of peacefully enjoying this season of waiting, I started to see how this motivation had tainted my life in so many ways in the past. I began to see how my pursuit of a calling was not motivated solely by a pure desire to please God and fulfill my God-given purpose in life, but it was also motivated by this desperate desire for God's approval. As I remained committed to the process of stillness and waiting on God, I slowly began to detoxify from this self-defeating motivation. I began to meditate on the good news message of salvation through Jesus Christ and really let it sink in that I didn't need to do anything else in my entire life in order to earn God's approval or acceptance. As time went on, I began to learn to enjoy simply being a child of God without adding any works of ministry into the mix. I began to learn to enjoy my relationship with God again. While I was going through this process of revelation regarding my own motives for pursuing a calling, I was continuing to struggle with the question I mentioned earlier. What would I do with my life if God never told me what my calling was? Up to that point in my life, I had never really considered that I might not find my calling at all. It had been an accepted fact that I would. It was simply a matter of time and remaining dedicated to the task of doing my part by using my gifts as I was aware of them, seeking God in prayer, and waiting for God to move. But now, I'd begun to doubt that certainty. As time went on, I slowly became more comfortable with just being a child of God, apart from the acts of service and performance that had characterized my past. It was in this environment, where I had temporarily taken a break from any ministry commitments, that I began to ask a third question. What do I do while I'm waiting on God to reveal my calling, if He ever does? The answer that I came up with to this question was to be an important step in helping me begin to understand how God designed us to find our true calling in life, and it's the question that we'll pick up with in the next episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Find Your Calling channel. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can find out when the next episode is released. If you want additional resources to help you in the process of finding your own calling, I encourage you to consider picking up the 2 books I've written on this topic, Find Your Calling Without Losing Your Mind, and Overcome the Obstacles and Succeed at Your Calling. Purchase links for both books are available in the show notes below. If you find the information in these videos helpful, please share these thoughts with your friends via social media. Thanks for watching, and may God bless your day.